The day Steve Harvey learned what it means to feel needed, the silence lasted exactly 7 seconds. 7 seconds that felt like 7 lifetimes in the bright lights of the family Feud studio. Steve Harvey stood frozen at his podium, cards scattered at his feet where he'd dropped them, staring at the woman who had just given an answer that stopped not just the game, but something deeper inside him. Rosa Esperanza stood at the contestant podium in a navy blue dress she'd bought specifically for this day, her silver hair perfectly styled, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the wooden edge. At 67, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had spent 4 decades putting everyone else's needs before her own. But in that moment, with the studio lights blazing down and 300 pairs of eyes watching, she looked smaller somehow. Vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with being on television. The fast money round had been going smoothly until that question. Steve had asked it with his usual energy and showman's flair, expecting the kind of quick, crowd-pleasing answer that made for good television. Rosa, we asked 100 people. Name something that gets harder as you get older. He'd been ready for the obvious responses. Walking, remembering names, reading small print. The kinds of answers that would make the audience chuckle and nod in recognition. Instead, Rosa had looked directly into his eyes and said 2 words that cut through every defense, every professional barrier, every carefully constructed wall that separated entertainer from audience. Feeling needed. The studio audience fell silent, not the polite quiet of a commercial break, but the heavy silence that follows truth soaked in a place that isn't prepared to hear it. Steve's smile didn't fade immediately. It flickered first, like a candle in wind, as his brain processed what she'd said. Then it disappeared entirely as the weight of those words settled over the room like a blanket. Behind the scenes, producers scrambled to understand what was happening. This wasn't in any manual. This wasn't part of the show format. But the cameras kept rolling, capturing something that couldn't be scripted or manufactured. They were witnessing the moment when a game show became something else entirely. Steve Harvey had built his career on quick wit and perfect timing. He could handle any situation, deflect any awkward moment, keep the energy flowing, no matter what contestants threw at him. But standing there in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking at Rosa Esperanza, he found himself in completely uncharted territory. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice stripped of its usual performance quality. The microphone picked up every word, broadcasting his confusion and growing concern to millions of viewers who would later call this the most powerful moment in game show history. Rosa straightened her shoulders, as if deciding that having come this far, she might as well tell the whole truth. "I raised 4 children," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Michael, Sandra, Roberto, and little Carmen. I was up every night when they were sick. I drove them to soccer practice, and piano lessons, and school plays. I helped with homework until midnight, and got up at 5 to pack their lunches." The rival family, the Hendersons from Ohio, stood frozen at their podium. They'd come to win money and have fun on television. They hadn't signed up to witness someone's life story unfold in real time. "For 40 years, Rosa continued, my phone rang constantly. Mom, how do I cook this? Mom, can you watch the kids? Mom, I need advice. Mom, can you help? And I loved it. Every single call, every crisis, every moment they needed me." Steve found himself moving without conscious decision. He stepped away from his position behind the podium and walked toward Rosa, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the polished studio floor. The production team in the control booth watched in amazement as their host abandoned every protocol they'd trained him to follow. "And now?" Steve asked gently, reaching Rosa's side. Rosa's composure finally cracked. Tears that she'd been holding back for months, maybe years, began to stream down her face. "Now Michael lives in Seattle with his family. Sandra's in Denver. Roberto moved to Miami for work. Carmen's in graduate school in Boston. They're all so busy with their lives, their careers, their own children." She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue that materialized from somewhere in the audience. A grandmother in the front row had passed it down, recognizing a kindred spirit in distress. They still call, Rosa continued, but not because they need me. They call out of obligation. Hi, Mom. Just checking in. 5 minutes of small talk about the weather and work. Then they have to go because the kids need dinner, or there's a meeting, or soccer practice. Steve felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't about aging or physical limitations. This was about purpose, about identity, about what happens to a person whose entire sense of self was built around being needed when that need suddenly evaporates. The studio lights seemed harsher now, too bright for this kind of vulnerability. But Rosa wasn't finished. Having started, she seemed unable to stop, as if decades of unspoken feelings were finally finding their voice. I spent yesterday reorganizing my medicine cabinet for the third time this month, she said with a laugh that held no humor. Not because it needed organizing, but because I needed something to do, something useful. I have drawers full of birthday cards I've bought in advance, Christmas presents purchased in July. I'm so ready to be needed that I'm preparing for needs that don't exist yet. Steve Harvey, the man who had made millions laugh, who had hosted thousands of hours of television, who prided himself on always having the right words, found himself speechless. He looked at Rosa Esperanza and saw not just a game show contestant, but every mother who had given everything to her children only to discover that success in parenting sometimes meant being left behind. The audience began to react, not with applause or cheers, but with the soft sounds of recognition, sniffles, quiet sobs, the rustling of tissues being passed between strangers who suddenly understood they were witnessing something sacred. Mrs. Rosa, Steve said, and his voice carried none of his usual television polish. This was just a man talking to a woman who was hurting. How long since you felt really needed? About 3 years, Rosa answered immediately. Carmen broke her leg sophomore year of college. I flew out to Boston and took care of her for 2 weeks. Made her soup, helped her shower, drove her to physical therapy. It was the best 2 weeks I'd had in years. The admission hung in the air like a prayer. Steve felt his throat tighten as he processed what she'd just revealed. This woman, who had devoted her life to nurturing others, was so starved for purpose that her daughter's injury had been a gift. But then she healed, Steve said. Then she healed, Rosa confirmed. And I flew home to my empty house and my organized medicine cabinet, and my phone that rings twice a week with duty calls from children who love me but don't need me anymore. Steve Harvey had interviewed thousands of people over his career. Politicians, celebrities, athletes, ordinary folks with extraordinary stories. But he'd never heard anything quite like this. Rosa's honesty was brutal and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. The Henderson family, their competitors in this now forgotten game, had tears in their eyes. Sarah Henderson, a mother of 3 young children, whispered to her husband, "Is that going to be me in 20 years?" Steve made a decision that would define not just this episode, but his entire understanding of what his role could be. He reached into his jacket and began to remove it, his movements deliberate and symbolic. "Mrs. Rosa," he said, draping his expensive suit jacket around her shoulders, "I want you to know something, and I want everyone in this studio and everyone watching at home to hear this too." The jacket was too big for Rosa's small frame, but she pulled it tighter around herself like armor. "You raised 4 successful, independent, caring human beings," Steve continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "You didn't just feed them and clothe them and drive them places. You gave them something infinitely more valuable. You gave them the confidence to build their own lives, the security to take risks, the knowledge that they are worthy of love." Rosa looked up at him, confusion mixing with hope in her eyes. "That's not past tense, ma'am," Steve said firmly. "That's present tense. That's happening right now every day, in Seattle and Denver and Miami and Boston. Every time your son makes a good decision, that's you still parenting. Every time your daughter treats someone with kindness, that's you still mothering. Every time your children show love to their own children, that's your influence still working. The studio erupted in applause, but Steve held up his hand for silence. He wasn't finished. And here's what else I know, he said, turning to address not just Rosa but the entire audience. In about 10 years, maybe 15, those grandchildren are going to start calling. Not because they have to, but because they're going to need someone who has time to listen. Someone who remembers what it's like to be young and scared and confused. Someone who loves them without conditions or expectations. Rosa's tears were flowing freely now, but her posture had changed. She stood straighter, as if remembering something she'd forgotten. Your children don't need you to pack their lunches anymore, Steve continued. But they're raising children who are going to need you to teach them how to bake cookies and how to plant flowers and how to believe in themselves when the world tells them they're not enough. He paused, letting his words sink in throughout the silent studio. Mrs. Rosa, you're not done being needed. You're just between assignments. The applause that followed wasn't television applause. It was the sound of recognition, of healing, of hundreds of people who had either lived this experience or feared it, finding hope in Steve's words. Rosa reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo, worn at the edges from handling. It showed 4 children of various ages, smiling at the camera with gap-toothed grins and mischievous eyes. This was them at Christmas 15 years ago, she said, her voice steady now. They made me a coupon book that year, good for 1 home-cooked meal. Good for 1 bedtime story. Good for 1 shopping trip. Good for 1 talk about anything. She laughed, and this time there was joy in it. I never used any of the coupons. I was saving them for when I really needed them. But maybe it's time to cash them in, Steve finished for her. Not because I'm desperate, Rosa said, understanding dawning in her voice. But because those coupons were their way of saying they still want to need me sometimes. Steve nodded, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. And maybe it's time to make some new coupon books for those grandchildren. Rosa laughed, a sound of pure delight that transformed her entire face. Carmen's getting married next year. She asked me to help plan the wedding, but I thought she was just being polite. Mrs. Rosa, Steve said, that girl needs you now more than she ever has. She's about to become a wife, and someday, a mother. She's going to need someone who remembers what it's like to love so much it scares you. Someone who can teach her that the best gift you can give your children is the confidence to leave you. The game show had been forgotten entirely. This wasn't about points or prizes anymore. This was about purpose, about the long arc of love, about understanding that being needed changes form, but never truly ends. Rosa reached up and touched Steve's face gently, a gesture so maternal it took his breath away. Thank you, she whispered, for reminding me that love doesn't retire. Steve covered her hand with his own. Mrs. Rosa, you keep that jacket, and every time you put it on, I want you to remember that somewhere in this world, there are 4 people who carry your voice in their heads, your values in their hearts, and your love in their souls. They may not need you to tie their shoes anymore, but they need you to be proud of them. They need you to believe in them. They need you to exist. As confetti fell and the studio audience rose to their feet, Rosa Esperanza stood wrapped in Steve Harvey's jacket, no longer the woman who had felt invisible and unnecessary. She was a mother. She was a teacher. She was a foundation upon which 4 lives had been built. The episode ended, but the story continued in phone calls that lasted longer than 5 minutes, in wedding planning sessions that stretched into the night, in grandchildren who would grow up knowing they had a grandmother who understood what it meant to love without limit. 3 months later, Steve Harvey received a photo in the mail. It showed Rosa Esperanza standing in a wedding dress shop, her arms around a radiant young woman in white. Both were laughing, their faces bright with joy and excitement. On the back, in careful handwriting, Carmen had written, "Thank you for reminding my mom that I still need her." The wedding wouldn't be the same without her touch. But the real transformation had started the day after the show aired. Rosa's phone had begun ringing, not with duty calls, but with something else entirely. Michael called from Seattle, his voice thick with emotion he'd clearly been holding back for years. "Mom," he'd said, "I watched your episode last night. I had no idea you felt that way. Sarah and we've been talking, and we want you to come stay with us for a month. Not to help with anything specific, just to be here. The kids keep asking about their grandmother in Atlanta, and I realize they barely know you. That's my fault, not yours." Sandra called from Denver with a proposal. She was starting a small catering business and needed someone with Rosa's cooking expertise to help develop recipes and teach her the family traditions she'd never written down. "I need you, Mom, really need you. Not because I can't figure it out myself, but because it won't be right without you." Roberto's call came with an invitation to Miami, where his wife was pregnant with their first child. "We want you here when the baby comes," he'd said simply. "Not just to visit, but to teach us how to be parents. You raised 4 of us, and we all turned out okay." That wasn't accident. The producers of Family Feud later revealed that Rosa's episode generated more viewer mail than any in the show's history. Letters poured in from children who called their mothers after watching, from empty nesters who recognized themselves in Rosa's story, from grandparents who had been afraid to impose on their children's busy lives. Steve Harvey framed one letter in his dressing room. It was from a 34-year-old father in Phoenix, who wrote, "I watched your show with my mother last week. Afterward, I asked her what she needed from me. She started crying and said she just wanted to feel useful again. I hired her to help run my small business. Best decision I ever made. She's not just my employee, she's my wisdom." The suit jacket became a symbol that traveled. Rosa wore it to Carmen's engagement party, where she stood up and told the room full of young people about the importance of asking for help, of letting the people who love you continue to love you in new ways. She wore it to Sandra's catering launch, where 3 generations of women worked side by side, Rosa's hands guiding her daughters as they perfected recipes that would become the signature dishes of a successful business. She wore it to the hospital in Miami when Roberto's son was born, and again when she spent 2 weeks teaching new parents how to swaddle and burp and survive on no sleep while somehow still feeling grateful for every exhausting moment. But perhaps most importantly, she wore it to Michael's house in Seattle, where she spent a month creating traditions with grandchildren who had barely known her voice, let alone her stories. She taught 8-year-old Emma how to braid friendship bracelets, and 10-year-old David how to make pancakes shaped like animals. "Grandma Rosa," Emma had said, one evening, as Rosa tucked her in, "Daddy says, you felt sad because you thought we didn't need you anymore. That's silly. We always needed you. We just didn't know how to tell you." The wisdom of children, Rosa reflected, often surpasses that of adults who complicate simple truths. A year later, Rosa Esperanza appeared on Steve Harvey's daytime talk show. Not as a contestant, but as a guest celebrating the ripple effects of authenticity. She walked onto the stage wearing the same suit jacket, now a permanent part of her wardrobe, and received a standing ovation before she'd said a word. "Mrs. Rosa," Steve said, embracing her like an old friend, "tell the people what you learned." Rosa looked out at the audience, at cameras that would broadcast her words to millions, and spoke with the confidence of someone who had rediscovered her purpose. "I learned that love isn't a resource that gets used up," she said. "It's a hell that gets better with practice. My children didn't stop needing me because they grew up. They started needing me in ways that required me to grow up too. The question isn't whether you're needed. The question is whether you're brave enough to let yourself be needed in new ways." Steve nodded, his own eyes bright with pride at seeing this transformation. "And what would you tell other parents who are struggling with this?" "I'd tell them to stop waiting for permission to love," Rosa replied, without hesitation. "Stop assuming that independence means isolation. Your children want to include you in their lives, but they may not know how to ask. So ask them. What do they need? What do they want to learn? What traditions do they want to continue? She paused, looking directly into the camera. And I'd tell them that being needed isn't about being depended upon. It's about being valued. Your experience matters. Your wisdom counts. Your love is irreplaceable. The audience erupted in applause, but Rosa wasn't finished. Most importantly, I'd tell them that empty nest doesn't mean empty heart. It just means there's room for new kinds of love to grow. After the show, Steve walked Rosa to her car personally, something he rarely did for guests. As she settled into the driver's seat, still wearing his jacket, he leaned down to the window. "Mrs. Rosa," he said, "you changed my life that day too. You know, you reminded me that television can be about more than entertainment. Sometimes it can be about healing." Rosa smiled, the expression transforming her entire face. "Steve, honey, you saved me from disappearing into my own irrelevance. That jacket isn't just a piece of clothing. It's a reminder that when someone gives you their armor, they're saying you matter." Today, Rosa Esperanza's story continues to ripple outward. She teaches cooking classes to young mothers who want to learn family recipes. She volunteers at a grief counseling center, helping others navigate transitions and loss. She writes letters to her grandchildren, not because they ask for them, but because someday they'll need the wisdom she's gathered. The Family Feud episode still plays in reruns, touching new audiences who recognize themselves in Rosa's courage to speak truth in a place that expected entertainment. But the real legacy isn't in the television archive. It's in the lives that were changed by watching someone transform from invisible to essential, simply by telling her truth. Rosa Esperanza learned that day that feeling needed isn't about being indispensable. It's about being unforgettable. And some things, once given, can never be taken away. Love is one of them. Purpose is another. And sometimes, all it takes to rediscover both is the courage to admit that you're lost, and the grace to accept that someone cares enough to help you find your way home.